Gentlemen, it was an honor to represent the John Birch Society in Australia. Before I went there, they sent me a tape recording of a speech given by a man named Charles Porter. Honorable Charles Porter was a member of the cabinet of one of the states. Each of the states has its cabinet in addition to the national cabinet. And he had just retired and helped to form an organization called People for a Free Australia. He lamented the following developments in his country: obsession for centralizing power on the part of the national government, the Constitution being destroyed, the High Court ignoring constitutional jurisprudence, basing vital decisions on personal preference, welfare gone berserk, ruining the economy and character of the people, taxes rising dramatically. If you make money, you're an enemy of society. A new morality, which is no morality at all, coming out of the universities. Private religious schools being oppressed, humanism being welcomed. Medicare upsetting parental rights by giving contraceptives to youngsters without parental knowledge. Government's aim is to reduce the medical profession to total subservience. This is Australia, gentlemen. Anti-discrimination legislation favoring homosexuals. Race relations problems. Land rights attacking private property rights. The nation being taken into an international economic order prior to becoming part of a world government. National defenses deteriorating. Radical feminism rampant. Affirmative action for women upsetting many, many areas. Middle class under attack. So-called opposition in the political sense, the Liberal Party opposing the dominant Labour Party, is no opposition at all. They have thought control widespread, free speech muzzled, intimidation practiced widely. I listened to that man's speech on the tape, and I said to myself, he could have given that in any city in the United States. It's exactly the same problems. I was somewhat shocked when I heard that speech, listening to it before I went to Australia, and then when I went there, I found quite a different perspective. It was a lot worse than I had expected. Australia is a land of 15 million people in a land area comparable to the 48 United States, which means it's 1/15 the size of our population. And they sit on the fringe of 2 billion Asians. The dominant Labour Party, vastly different from its pre-World War II days, it is now totally dominated by socialists, communists, feminists, homosexuals. The Prime Minister is a man named Bob Hawke, who is a Fabian socialist and proud of it. He's a Rhodes Scholar. He came back from England years ago from his educational training and was brought into the Australian Confederation of Trade Unionists. And he was groomed right from the beginning for something that was coming later on. He became known as Mr. Fix-It. They had a labor problem. They would solve the labor problem. They would bring Bob Hawke in and say, okay, Bob, here's what you do. Here's how you solve it. You get the credit. And he's now the Prime Minister of the country. The Liberal Party, supposed to be the opposition, but is just as much dominated by Fabian socialists. The most recent Prime Minister from the Liberal Party is Malcolm Fraser, himself also a Fabian socialist, and proud of it, but also a member of the Australian Institute for International Affairs, which I will discuss a little bit further. Australia still has Commonwealth status with England. The top political official, largely ceremonial, but does have some power, is the appointed Governor-General. The Australian Constitution allows this Governor-General, or the Queen, to disallow any law. The Queen is also empowered to depose a Prime Minister, which was done in 1975 when Gough Whitlam, a Labour Party Prime Minister, was removed just by fiat, and Whitlam was replaced, he was a Fabian socialist, by Malcolm Fraser from the other party, a Fabian socialist. Gough Whitlam has gone on now and is now an official at UNESCO. They are now trying to change the Constitution in Australia to preclude even that from being done in the future. The present situation in Australia is a debt per capita equal to Argentina and Mexico. Somebody recently remarked that Mexico owes the world $90 billion. Somebody said, how much is that in pesos? And the answer was, all of them. Australia's in the same fix. They have 9% unemployment, but 40% of those who are employed work for government. They have a negative population growth. In 1961, they had 10 million people, and they had 240,000 births. 20 years later, they had 15 million people, and they had fewer births. 2/3 of the marriages end in divorce. 1/3 of all conceptions are aborted. No more compulsion in any way for a man to support his wife and child. They have child care laws. They have requirements that you send child support to your spouse if you leave and so, but they don't enforce them anymore. It's an open invitation for anybody who gets tired of it, gets tired of the wife and the kids, just walk off. They immediately go on the dole, and nobody goes after the offending father, and they have an automatic dole at age 16. They have schooling only until age 16. They go through the 10th grade, and then they go on the dole, and there's no problem, and there are all kinds of young people up on the Great Barrier Reef just enjoying themselves, having a great time riding the surf, and they're on the dole. 70% of the people claim to be Christian, but only 10% go to church regularly, and I think many of them would be better off if they didn't go at all. They have a 35-hour work week, every 4th week off, 5 weeks of vacation, 12 weeks long leave after 10 years of service, 10 hours a month per sick leave. And I asked some people, I said, how do you get anybody in the, you have to hire about half again as many people in order to get the work done that you ordinarily would have to do. And this is all a result of the labor union domination. 70% of the homes have video recorders. And the pornography market is immense. And it is dragging down the morality of the country. The people don't have to go to a local theater to watch the porno. They just go down and they get the tape and they bring it home, and there it is. 72% of the land in the nation is owned by government. 13% more of it has been put aside into the Aboriginal land rights claims, leaving 12% of Australia to be owned in private property. Federal ministers and senior public official servants can now take their mistresses on overseas trip at public expense. They call this the de facto arrangement. You can take your wife or you can take your de facto wife at public expense. The military is almost not there. They have a very small army. The Navy has 6 destroyers and 15 patrol boats. They did have an aircraft carrier, but the aircraft carrier is being towed right now to Japan for scrap. They have about 50 or 100 aircraft. Singapore, which is a city nation, has a larger military than does Australia. U.S. ships recently were not welcome in Sydney Harbor, but they did become welcome in Brisbane, which is in the Queensland state. The ANZUS alliance, which many of those people have felt was their safeguard over the years, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, has been fractured totally by the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who doesn't want to have anything to do with the United States because we now have nuclear weapons. They have compulsory voting in Australia. If you don't vote, if you don't go down and pick up your ballot, you will be fined. So people do go and vote. And they are now up over 12% of the people who, when they vote, write down Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, or they simply draw a line through the ballot and put it back into the thing. The cynicism is spreading and spreading wildly. Now, one of the very difficult problems they have there is that the political parties have the nomination process. There is no opportunity for a Larry McDonald to steal the nomination and get himself elected to Congress. The political parties dominate. And then the elected members of the parliament must vote as they are told by the party, or they will be forced out of the party, or they will not be allowed to be the nominee the next time they run for office. And so the chance for them to affect political change is a great deal far removed from ours. There are occasional conscience issues that they have. Abortion used to be one of them. In other words, when a vote on the subject of abortion came up, you could vote whatever you felt. the political party wouldn't demand that you go along with the party's point of view, but that has been changed as well. Now let me give you an example of some of the things that have happened in this poor country, some of the things that are, I'm afraid, on the road for us unless we in the John Birch Society succeed. Let me mention, and I'll mention it again, I couldn't help every single day I was in Australia. I'd go to bed at night and I'd say, thank God for Robert Welch. Because I said to myself over and over again, there, but for him go we. Thank God for Robert Welch that he did what he did when he did it, because I could see the tremendous breaking action that we have effected in this John Birch Society, and they have nothing. In 1982, the people in the state of Tasmania, there are 6 states, 1 territory. The state of Tasmania, of course, is an island off the southeast coast, fairly large size island. They wanted to build more power for themselves. They wanted to have, some of the people would have loved to have had a nuclear power plant, and it's an ideal place for one, but nuclear power is totally out. You can't even consider it in that country. So they said that they would try to build a hydroelectric power dam. And water resources has been a state responsibility, and the tradition and part of the constitutional interpretation is legitimate, and it has been a state responsibility. And so the dam was proposed. Immediately it became a conservation issue, the radical conservationists. And they declared the area where they wanted to build this Franklin Dam a wilderness area. It became a World Heritage Site. And that's very significant. The Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, the Labor Socialist, sent the matter to the High Court, which is their equivalent of the Supreme Court in the United States. And the Supreme Court, the High Court in Australia, ruled that because Australia was a signatory to the United Nations World Heritage Treaty, which had been signed by the previous Prime Minister, the UN relationship took precedence over the laws of the state of Tasmania and the national government in Australia, and you can't build the dam. Now back up a second and let's think of the significance of that. The significance of that is that Australia signing a United Nations convention meant that the United Nations now superseded all of their state and federal laws. And it was so recognized immediately by the people in Australia, the people that I met. Most of them don't care, but the people I met were good, honest, honorable people worried about their country. Australia is a signatory to 385 international compacts under the United Nations. The people told me, said, we're done. The United Nations rules Australia. They had recently a Sex Discrimination Act. This is the equivalent of the Equal Rights Amendment. It was in 1980 that the Fraser government, prior to the Hawke government, signed a United Nations Convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. In 1983, the Hawke government ratified this United Nations Convention. In 1984, the Sex Discrimination Act came up before the Parliament. There are all kinds of anti-ERA type people there in the country. There's a group called Women Who Want to Be Women. There's a wonderful lady I met named Jackie Butler, who is the Phyllis Schlafly of Australia, and has had Phyllis Schlafly come to Australia to speak and go around the country and so forth. In 1984 now they're debating this thing in the Parliament, the Sex Discrimination Act, and the members of Parliament were told by their political parties that they had to vote for the Sex Discrimination Act because Australia had signed the UN Convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. They voted for it. It is now part of the law, and it is wreaking all kinds of havoc. I think that is extremely significant. And I wonder sometimes how long before we are in the same fix if we don't get more of our John Birch Society activity going, more people aware. It's a wonderful lesson for us to know what can happen if you allow the United Nations to entangle its web over you. In Queensland, happily, there are some good political leaders. Queensland is the northeast part of the country. And of course, the northern part of the country there is the warm part. The southern part is the cool part. They're in the southern hemisphere. They, in fact, call Queensland the deep north. Queensland's national party which is not really a national party, has some good political leaders. And the premier, which is the equivalent of the governor of the state of Queensland, is a wonderful man named Joe Bjelke Petersen. He's a Danish immigrant, or his family was. He's conservative, he's patriotic, he's colorful, and he's a wonderful leader, but he's 75 years old. And I asked the people around him, I asked some of his top aides that I got to meet and talk to, I said, well, what's in line after Joe? Joe, his name is Johannes, they call him Joe, J-O-H. I said, what's in line after him? And they said, well, there's a guy already being touted as the successor to him. And I said, well, what about him? He said, he's no good. I said, well, why doesn't somebody do something here? Why don't, if you want to retain your state of Queensland? Well, he said, we're just hoping Joe holds on. He's very vibrant. And I thought, oh, boy. Now, the power of the labor unions is absolutely immense and frightening. But Joe Bjelke Petersen broke their power, at least in his part of the country. The labor unions decided to shut off the electric power. They had a strike, a power workers' strike. And for 10 days, this part of Australia, the power would go on, the power would go off with no warning. People were losing the food in their freezers and the inconvenience, and people were in trains and the trains would stop and all kinds of things. You imagine the inconvenience of this, a labor union. The issue was that the power company had been hiring a few non-union contract laborers to do a little bit of work here. And so Joe Bjelke Petersen took the bull by the horns and he fired the strikers. And he hired other people to come in and run the power stations. The unions asked the High Court to use the International Labor Organization treaty that Australia had signed on to overrule the state government. So far, it had not been done. Sympathy strikes failed, and the nation, all of a sudden, the people all across the nation began applauding Joe Bjelke Petersen. He broke the strike. Finally, one of these strikes was broken. And immediately throughout the country, and I met this wherever I went, there were suggestions that Queensland secede from Australia and become its own country. I talked to some of the Queensland leaders about that, and they said, it's impossible. It couldn't be done, and so forth. But the power of the labor unions is very, very important, and the labor unions are totally committed to socialism, totally committed to destroying a wonderful, productive country. Another area that they have vast problems is the Aboriginal land rights business. The Aboriginals are, to them, what the American Indians are here in our country. 1.2% of the population, about 200,000 of them. They're very docile people. They're very lovable people. They want no trouble for anybody. They're very irresponsible. They go and they take a job for a while, and all of a sudden they don't show up, and you go to look for them, and they're gone. They've moved to someplace else. They've never caused anybody any trouble, but radical lawyers have become spokesmen for the Aboriginals and have tied up 12.5% of the land. They can take more with no compensation to owners. And it's a very spotty taking of land, which means it interrupts all kinds of things. Somebody was going to try to build a railroad across the northern part of the country. You would now have to go through Aboriginal land areas. You would have to go through what they call the sacred sites of the Aborigines. The Aborigines have no sacred sites. They don't care about it. It's all concocted. It's all radical lawyer promoted. And these lawyers have appealed to the United Nations to allow the Aborigines to set up a nation within a nation. That sounds familiar. They've tied up the mineral wealth of the land. They have unbelievable mineral wealth in that country. The greatest and most productive iron ore deposits that have been found anywhere in the world have been found there in Australia. And most of the land, the interior part of the country, has not even been explored. I visited with a man who was very, very active in this area, and he had put together mining proposals and areas where he wanted very much to help the country to be able to develop itself. And he showed me first a picture of an area that was taken from an airplane. And it looked like the moon. There was nothing there. Of course, some biologists and entomologists would probably disagree and say, well, there are a couple of bugs there, I'm sure, or maybe there's a little bush somewhere. But you couldn't see anything, and this was not that high in the airplane. It looked like the moon. And then he showed me a book this thick, looked like the Manhattan telephone book. He said, this is the environmental impact statement that we had to prepare in order to try to mine this land. And he said it wasn't enough. We still haven't got permission. There's a wonderful minister down there named Bob Brown, who himself is an Aboriginal. Bob Brown recently was invited by some of the Aborigines to come into the Aboriginal land and to preach to them. And he did so, and he was arrested by the federal authorities. He did not get a permit, not from the Aboriginals, but from the federal government to go on to the Aboriginal land, and therefore he was arrested. And he himself is an Aboriginal. He was invited by them and so forth, so you can see what's happening here. Now, when I went to Australia, I started in Sydney, which is in the middle of the country on the east coast, and then I went north to Queensland. Then I went south to Melbourne, and then over a little west to Adelaide. When I got to Sydney, I met some people. I spoke before some groups. I tried to tell them what's happening in America. I tried to suggest to them what they should do if they're going to be able to succeed. And I kept saying to them, where's the conspiracy here in Australia? And I would get an answer. Somebody would say, well, it's the Fabians. I said, well, yes, the Fabians certainly is part of the conspiracy, but is there an organization anywhere here in Australia? They didn't know. Up to Queensland, the same problem. The people I met, anxious people, putting out a little newsletter here, a little something there, concerned, understanding that their country's going down the drain, didn't know what to do about it. Where's the conspiracy? I kept asking. They didn't know. They didn't know. Finally, I got to Melbourne. I was 10 days into the trip. Now, Melbourne is to Canberra, the national capital, what New York City is to Washington, our national capital. A lot of the formal things are done at the national capital, but the thinking and the power and so forth is in New York, and it's in Melbourne. And here we were in Melbourne. So I had given my talk. One of the talks that I gave quite frequently was the conspiracy above communism, and I talked about what was happening here in America, and about the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission and organizations like that and so forth. And after I finished this speech, I talked to this fellow and I said, all right, where is it here in Australia? And he said, well, he says, it's the Australian Institute for International Affairs. Ah, he said, ah. Now, most of you, I'm sure, are aware that when the Council on Foreign Relations was created in 1919 in Paris and then formally started in 1921 in America, the British counterparts at the meeting started the Royal Institute for International Affairs out of London. Well, the Australian Institute for International Affairs began in 1933. So I was talking to him about it, and he was telling me a little bit about it. I reached over and I grabbed the telephone book, and I opened it up, and I said, Australian Institute for International Affairs. I said, it's right there. I said, do you know where Jolimont Street is? He said, yes, I do. I said, well, good. We're going down there tomorrow. He said, what? I said, yeah. I said, let's go down and we'll ask them about themselves. He said, I think you mean that, don't you? I said, yes, yes, I do. I said, now, I'll go in and I'll say, I'll do the talking. I'm an American, and I'll say, I'm interested in foreign affairs, and I saw your organization. I'd like to know a little bit about it. So, okay, they said, there were two Aussies there. They said, okay, we'll do it. I said, fine. We went down. We met a lovely 60-year-old woman who worked for the organization. And she was just delighted to show us around and to tell us all about the organization, and we began to talk, and I asked her if she had any pamphlets or anything that she could let me have, and she said, well, I'll have to go in the other room to get them. We were in a room bigger than this one, and there were about 140 chairs set up in a semicircle. Each of the chairs had a little desk thing on it for taking notes, and she explained that they had their luncheon meetings here, and this is where they had their speakers when they came, and it was always invitation only. You would only be able to come if you were invited. And there was a huge wall of books, all books on foreign policy and history and so forth, and then a short little bookshelf over here. Well, when she went outside to get me the pamphlets, I walked over to this little bookshelf over there, and the top shelf of that one was full of the foreign affairs from the Council on Foreign Relations. And the second shelf was full of the Trilateral Commission materials. And the third shelf was the Royal Institute for International Affairs. Well, she brought back the materials, and we talked some more, and I said, now tell me about the history of this place. Well, she said, it began in 1933, and at that time, she said, the government here in Australia didn't even have a foreign affairs department. And she said they formed, and they began to advise the Prime Minister, and then they advised the Prime Minister to start a foreign affairs department, and he did in 1938, and some of our people staffed it. I said, I'll bet they did. There's a wall outside with all kinds of pictures of the people who've come to visit. I recognized some of the photographs, but I asked her if she would explain to me who these people were, and she said, well, these are people who've come over the years to speak at our meetings here at this Melbourne office of the AIIA. And I said, all right, who are they? She said, well, Bertrand Russell and Julian Huxley and Arnold Toynbee and Gunnar Myrdal and William O. Douglas and Eugene McCarthy. And how many of you know Gunnar Myrdal? 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. The Supreme Court of the United States injects the federal government into the school problems. They based their decisions on the writings of a book by a Swedish socialist named Gunnar Myrdal. Never mind the Constitution, never mind judicial precedent, we're using a Swedish socialist as our authority to make a decision like this. Gunnar Myrdal's daughter is the wife of the president of Harvard University. Tell me there's no conspiracy. 1983 was the 50th anniversary of the Australian Institute for International Affairs. And she said, we had a wonderful affair. We had a great gathering and celebrated our 50th anniversary. And our guest speaker on that occasion was the leader of the South African Institute for International Affairs, Mr. Harry Oppenheimer of De Beers. So she said, now, we just recently had Paul Wolfowitz from your country, and he came down to explain what is now happening about the ANZUS alliance. Wolfowitz is a proud member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And she said, oh, and then just a few days ago, she said we had a surprise visit from somebody you may know, a man named Richard Gardner. Richard Gardner happens to be a pet peeve of mine. Richard Gardner is the man who, in 1974, authored an article in the Foreign Affairs magazine of the Council on Foreign Relations called The Hard Road to World Order. And in his book, he talked about performing an end run on national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece, through the United States getting involved in the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the Food Organization, the Population Organization, and so forth. Richard Gardner is a very important man. In 1976, the Australian Institute for International Affairs published a document called Australia in the New World Order, financed in part by the Ford Foundation in the United States. So here we were. We were sitting right at the core of the conspiracy there in Australia. And we walked out of there with my two Australian friends, and they were very glad that we had taken the time to go visit. And then we went to meet a very impressive man, a very sad man, a man whom I had already earned deep respect for from others telling me about him, and I'd read some of the things that he'd written. His name is Bob Santamaria. Bob Santamaria has formed the National Civic Council, and he did so over 40 years ago. He has spent practically all of his adult life trying to get decent, honorable Australian people, especially people in the labor movement already, to take a leading role in their local labor union and in the national labor union, and to keep the labor unions from doing to Australia what he had already seen happening in England and elsewhere. He's a considerable man. He employs about 33 people in his organization, but it's just that special interest. He publishes a weekly news magazine called News Weekly. It's by far the best thing in that country, and his column is on the back of it each time. He spent over 40 years of his life doing this. Most impressive man, an intellectual. We sat with him, and I had my two Australian friends with me. And I asked him, I said, Mr. Santamaria, would you please assess Australia's situation for me today? And he put his elbows on his desk and he leaned across almost to kind of subdue his tones, although it wasn't really subdued. And he said, Australia is doomed. There is no saving Australia. And there are 3 reasons why, he said. Population decline, high interest rates, and abnormally high wages far beyond what the productivity of the companies can handle, all due to the labor unions. But he said, Australia is doomed. I said to him, Mr. Santamaria, why then do you fight on? He said, history is full of surprises. I said, are you talking about the possibility of divine intervention? He said, you better believe it. That's the only thing that can save Australia. This man is probably the leader of whatever opposition exists there. He is the most knowledgeable. And he's practically beaten. He knows about the John Birch Society. He knows about how important it is to his country that we succeed here in the United States. And I kept telling those people all across Australia, I said there was reluctance on the part of my superiors in the Birch Society to let me go down there for 18 days because what Australia needs, in addition to its own problems, is to have America get back on the ball. And my time might be better spent if I spent those 18 days in America rather than going down to Australia. But it might be a learning experience, and we might be able to help ourselves in learning what's happening there in Australia. I met a man in the labor union. He is an official of the labor union in the state of South Australia. He's an Indian by birth from India. He's a Shiite Muslim. He is a remarkable man. He has spent many years of his life working in Pakistan and other places. He finally ended up there in Australia, and he became a union official. And he is harassed terribly by all of the problem people in his union. They lock his office. They change the locks. They do this kind of thing. They do that kind of thing. They're trying to get him to quit and to force him out and run. He said that the union that he's a member of has 18,000 members, and there are 10 communists that run it. And there are not 10 more communists behind to take their places. These 10 communists are the power, and they run it, and there's nothing that anybody can do about it. They're trying to force him out even of his subsidiary official position. I spoke at a Lithuanian organization, Lithuanian immigrants. There are ethnic groups down there, just like we have in America. And these people who fled communism from Europe and went to Australia now feel totally betrayed. They feel that what they fled is happening all over again. They're now, of course, 30, 40 years older. They said, there's no place for us to go, and what do we do, and so forth. It was pitiful. There is an organization called Taxpayers United, and they formed a trim committee. Tax reform immediately. I talked to the fellow. I said, where did you get that? Where did you get the name? He said, we got it from a friend in Canada who suggested it. I said, he probably got it from the John Birch Society. And those people put out good information, too. But there's very little appreciation of the conspiracy, and very little that I think can be done. I kept suggesting to the people, they said, what should we do? I said, well, you need a John Birch Society. Okay, how do we do that? I said, well, you need a leader and you need a manifesto. You need a Robert Welch. You need a blue book. Well, can't we use the blue book that you have? I said, well, there are parts of it that you could use, but you've got to tell the people what's happening here in Australia. I didn't see anybody that I could find that would be able to do that. I did appear, however, on the Good Morning Australia television show. I gave 15 talks and made 6 or 8 radio TV appearances, and one of them was Good Morning Australia, which is like our Good Morning America here. And during the course of that, the man had a copy of the beliefs and principles of the John Birch Society, and it talked there very briefly about the fact that we don't like democracy and we do like a republic. And they have no appreciation at all of what this means. In fact, the word republic scares them. They love democracy and they think America is a democracy. So in 2 or 3 sentences I tried to explain it, but you only had 5 minutes on the show, and I didn't want to take up all the time on just that subject. Well, I finished the show, and an hour and a half later, a senator from one of the a federal senator got up and called a press conference and denounced me and suggested that that I was a subversive and that the Bureau of Immigration ought to examine the situation and maybe I should be thrown out of the country. And so the Australian newspaper ran an article about me visiting John Bircher labeled subversive, which is one of my badges of honor. Well, there are many, many other things to say, but let me say it again. Let me just close and say again how many times it occurred to me in Australia, how many times since. Thank God for Robert Welch. Thank God for the John Birch Society, because there, but for what he did and all of the efforts of you folks, there go we. We can do it. They're in much deeper trouble, and I learned a lot, and I hope I've been able to explain some of that to you. Thank you.